Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, I give an overview of the second level of learning in the skill learning sequence, verbal association. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. My apologies that this week's episode is coming out a bit later than expected. My husband's grandmother had passed away at the age of 91, so we took some time last weekend to travel for her funeral and be with family. And then my husband and daughter had some time off of school this week for their midwinter break, which cut into my quiet recording time at home. Plus, I had a bunch of committee work that was due this week as well. So all that to say thanks for your patience as I work to get this episode recorded and ready for you. Today, I'm kicking off a new mini-series of episodes in which we'll dig into the second level of Gordon's skill learning sequence. As I've talked about previously on this podcast, the skill learning sequence is the theoretical framework at the heart of music learning theory, which provides possible pathways for the sequencing of how students learn musical skills. This skill learning sequence is so important because one of the core tenets of MLT is sequential learning, that we learn music easily and naturally if we are allowed to learn in a sequential way. Way back in episode 3, I talked about this core tenet of sequential learning, and in episode 9, I gave an overview of this skill learning sequence. I'll link to both of those episodes in the show notes in case you want to check them out. As I discussed back in episode 9, the skill learning sequence provides possible pathways for learning musical content through the development of various musical skills. And this is structured into two different types of learning: discrimination learning and inference learning. Remember that in the skill learning sequence, in discrimination learning, students learn skills by rote using familiar musical material. And then in inference learning, students apply the skills they learned through discrimination learning to teach themselves new musical material or to create new musical material. In this mini-series of episodes, I'll be focusing on the second level of the skill learning sequence, which is called verbal association. Before we get into the verbal association level, let's remind ourselves of what's been happening at the previous level, oral-oral. Remember that at the oral-oral level, students listen to and perform familiar musical content on neutral syllables. So in terms of tonal skills at the oral-oral level, students have been singing resting tone in familiar tonalities on a neutral syllable, they've been echoing tonal patterns on neutral syllables, and they've been orally recognizing where familiar tonal patterns happen in familiar songs. Students would also be learning to perform chord roots to familiar songs. In terms of rhythm skills at the oral-oral level, students have been moving to and performing macrobeats and microbeats on neutral syllables in familiar meters, they've been echoing familiar rhythm patterns on neutral syllables, and they've been orally recognizing where familiar rhythm patterns occur in familiar songs and chants. And remember that all this learning is happening by rote at the oral-oral level because it's a level of discrimination learning. In discrimination learning, the students always respond to a model, most often the teacher, who demonstrates the skill for students before asking them to perform the skill. In other words, the teacher always gives the answer in discrimination learning. Once students have had enough opportunities to develop skills at the oral-oral level of discrimination learning, they can apply those skills by bridging to inference learning. Remember that in inference learning, students are figuring out something unfamiliar or creating something using the skills they've developed in discrimination learning. So we could bridge from the oral level to the generalization level or to the creativity improvisation level and give students opportunities to figure things out or create things on neutral syllables. If you're new to MLT and haven't already listened to the mini-series of episodes I did on oral learning last year, I'll link to those in the show notes. Episode 33 focused on general ideas about oral learning. Episode 34 focused on oral tonal skills. Episode 35 focused on oral rhythm skills. Episode 36 focused on bridging from oral to generalization. And episode 37 focused on bridging from oral to creativity improvisation. Next, at the verbal association skill level, students learn to sing tonal solfege and chant rhythm syllables or rhythm solfege and use them as a tool for retaining and labeling content previously audiated and performed at the oral level. Solfege syllables are now superimposed on familiar tonal patterns and familiar rhythm patterns that have already been learned at the oral level, as well as on the resting tone or macrobeats and microbeats of songs and chants learned in familiar tonalities or meters. Because we're using syllables at verbal association, students can also start to use solfege syllables to begin associating names to tonalities, meters, and functions previously experienced and audiated at the oral level. Before I go on, a quick word about why we don't start with solfege syllables right away in MLT. Because sometimes people will ask me, why don't we just start with solfege right away? Why do we take the time to let students learn the content with neutral syllables first at oral? The answer is that learning on neutral syllables first gives students an opportunity to learn to audiate the sounds before adding syllables. The syllables aren't being used to teach audiation necessarily. The purpose of using solfege syllables at the verbal association skill level is not to teach students to audiate specific sounds, because that should have already started to happen at the oral level. Instead, sounds are taught first at oral, and then with syllables at verbal association as a way to name what has already been heard. By doing this, by associating syllables to and naming what has already been heard, performed, and audiated, students learn to ascribe external meaning to the content and context they've already begun giving internal meaning to at the oral level. I'm going to say that again. At the verbal association level, students learn to ascribe external meaning to the content and context to which they've already begun giving internal meaning at the oral level. If we were to start with solfege syllables right away and not take the time to let students learn first with neutral syllables, we would be forcing students to give external labels to things they hadn't yet internalized through audiation. So at oral, students learn to hear, audiate, and perform the sounds on neutral syllables, and then apply solfege and rhythm syllables at verbal association, which equips them to retain, recall, and categorize familiar patterns, tonalities, and meters that they've already begun audiating. This process of learning to name tonalities, meters, and pattern functions should not be confused with music theory. Students don't learn theoretical explanations at the verbal association skill level, like things like how to construct a major or minor scale in terms of half steps and whole steps. That would be theoretical understanding. Instead, at verbal association, students simply listen to solfege or rhythm syllables performed by a model. They perform the sounds with syllables themselves, and they start learning to recognize and name tonalities, meters, and functions by rote, on the basis of the syllables being audiated. We're not explaining why they're called what they're called. We're just giving them a name. Also, remember that students don't associate solfege or rhythm syllables to unfamiliar patterns or independently identify the tonality or meter of unfamiliar songs and chants, because those skills would be inference learning. Instead, imitating patterns using tonal syllables and rhythm syllables in discrimination learning at verbal association gives students the readiness they need to teach themselves unfamiliar patterns later in inference learning. As with learning at the oral skill level, students don't learn to read or write music notation at the verbal association level. Notation is a symbol system, and so it's not formally introduced until the symbolic association skill level. Symbolic association, symbol. At verbal association and subsequent levels of learning, tonal solfege and rhythm syllables should act as signs, not symbols. I'm going to say that again. Tonal solfege and rhythm syllables should always act as signs, not symbols. Gordon explained the difference between signs and symbols in his 2012 edition of Learning Sequences in Music. On page 109, he wrote, quote, "Consider signs as sounds of pitches and durations we hear, and symbols as written notes we see as representation of those sounds." End quote. So to put it another way, signs are something we hear, while symbols are something we see. Therefore, it's important that solfege be performed and heard, but not seen at the verbal association skill level. If students were seeing solfege, like if they were reading or writing solfege spelled out in letters, like D-O for do, then the syllables would actually be acting as a symbol. Thus, students would be inadvertently engaging in symbolic association. Furthermore, when solfege is used in writing, it typically acts as a crutch for what is lacking in audiation. For example, if a teacher were to write out the pitches for an entire song in solfege syllables so that the students could play it on their instrument, the students likely would be decoding the written symbols without audiation. They would be using the written solfege just to tell them what fingers to put down, as opposed to truly audiating the content. To ensure that solfege is used in a manner that supports audiation rather than replaces or contradicts it, Gordon strongly recommended that solfege serve only as a sign and not as a symbol. In other words, solfege should be heard and performed, but not written down visually or read from that written down version. Over the next several episodes, we're going to be digging deeper into the verbal association skill level. First, in the next episode, I'll discuss choosing tonal solfege and rhythm syllable systems for use in MLT-based instruction. Then I'll spend a whole episode talking about specific tonal skills learned at the verbal association skill level, another episode talking about specific rhythm skills developed at the verbal association level, and then I'll also do a couple episodes on bridging from verbal association to generalization and creativity improvisation. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.